Friends, welcome to our study of the book of Ruth. This is going to be a great 4 weeks, a real opportunity for us to dive into one of the most amazing stories in the Old Testament. And particularly cool, particularly worth our attention, because Jesus chose to insert himself into this family. This is part of Jesus' family line. And you could probably argue that everyone in the genealogy of Christ is there for a reason. God could have inserted himself into any family, and he chose the one he inserted himself into really specifically to teach us a bunch of stuff and to talk about who he is and who he wants to become family with, you and I eventually. So we can expect to find ourselves in the story of Ruth. And so what we're going to do to begin with is get some really good context for this story, to figure out what was going on in the land at that time. Because the whole story opens with in the days when the judges ruled over Israel. So who on earth were the judges? And this is really quite an important piece of context because it'll set up what's so special about this story in the context of what was going on in that time. Before we do anything else, I want you to grab your Bible, flick back one book to the book of Judges, which we suspect was written by the same person. There are quite good arguments to be made that Samuel wrote both. And you can certainly see at the end of the book of Ruth that if Samuel wrote it, he's making a bit of a case for why David should be king. And so if it's true that Samuel wrote both books, that's just another reason to have a look back. And so I want you to go to the book of Judges and check out the following. Can someone firstly please go and read the whole first chapter? Just in your group, go and check out Judges chapter 1, and you can read through into the 13th verse of chapter 2. That'll give you a great setup for what was going on there. Then also have a look at chapter 3, verse 7 to 30. And one other person can get chapter 17, verse 6. It's just one line that kind of sums up the whole thing. But the first chapter up until 2, verse 13, and the third chapter from verse 7 to verse 30, go quickly read those. Okay, so you've just waded through some Judges, and it's a tough read. I mean, we love the book of Judges for the heroes like Samson and Deborah and so on. But you'll have noticed a few things immediately about the book of Judges. The one thing that gets set up right at the outset is that the people have been told to go and possess the land, and they don't do a good job. The tribe of Judah seems to do a fairly good job. Every other tribe does a particularly bad job. Benjamin especially comes in for some tap because they just don't possess the land. They don't drive out all the enemies. They're prepared to tolerate other groups of people in this amazing promised land that God has given them. And God starts to warn them, look, if you leave these other tribes, particularly living in the valleys, the Israelites would live up on the hilltops, but all throughout the land were these little tributaries of other tribes, other peoples with other religions in those valleys. If you leave them there, if you tolerate this stuff, if you're not prepared to eradicate godlessness from this land, then their gods are going to be a temptation to you. Their people are going to be a source of pain to you. And God keeps saying, drive them out, and they keep on failing to do that. Now that's interesting context to begin with for the book of Ruth, because Ruth, as we'll discover in a moment, is a Moabitess. She comes from one of the lands, one of the peoples who were in that land who were supposed to be got rid of. In fact, Moab is one of the chief enemies of God. We can quickly skip back to Deuteronomy 23 to hear what God had to say about the Moabites. He said no, they're not even allowed into the temple, have nothing to do with them. Anyone who ends up with a sort of Moabite ancestor for a whole bunch of generations, they're not even allowed in the temple. They can't worship the Lord. And so God is pretty keen that we distance ourselves from the Moabites as much as possible, that Moab was the enemy. So fascinating that Ruth is a Moabitess, that she comes from this land. But it also gives some context to the fact that her father-in-law, Elimelech, chose to go to Moab. See, that's how the story begins, that in the time when the judges ruled Israel, there was this family, Naomi and her husband Elimelech, and things were going badly in their town, in their area. There was a famine. And once again, if you've skipped back to Judges, you'll notice that that was the cycle that kept happening, that the people would reject God, that God would then hand them over either to their enemies or to some tough famine-type conditions, and an opportunity for them to return to him, to get their attention, come and repent. And if the people did that, if they repented, then God was always faithful to forgive them. But in this instance, instead of choosing to submit to that process, to stick with the people of God and to repent and to turn back towards him and trust that the famine would end, Elimelech chooses to do the very worst thing he could do, to leave the people of God, to head down into one of the valleys, work his way out of the promised land and end up in the land of Moab, rejecting the process of God, rejecting the people of God, and in the process, rejecting the promises of God, this promised land with all of his inheritance. And they're interesting kind of allusions to the way the tribe of Benjamin particularly failed to claim their inheritance. It's like God makes us these promises, he sets up these inheritances for us, and then he says, now be uncompromising in going after them. And the amazing thing about all this is Ruth, who's someone from Moab who had no inheritance in God, chooses to be so faithful that she ends up inserting herself into the promises. Where someone else who was born with the great head start, Elimelech, born an Israelite in the promised land, rejects the promises and walks away from his inheritance. So there's that great sort of backdrop to the fact that this Moabitess, who was born without inheritance, ends up claiming an inheritance that someone who was born with inheritance, her father-in-law Elimelech, walked away from because he was prepared to compromise so much. Another fascinating backdrop to the story of Judges and then going into the story of Ruth is, I suppose, a philosophical one. It's how we look at history. If you've looked through the book of Judges, you'll have noticed it's cyclical. Something wonderful happens, some powerful person of God comes and rescues the people of God, and they respond going, oh, wow, God, you're so amazing. We were praying that you'd save us, now you've saved us. And then you can see within a generation, they've rejected God and gone back to their old ways. And it's this terrible cycle of faithlessness, then the rescue of God, and some high-minded spiritual promises, which within a generation they can't keep. And that's one real view on history, the cyclical view on history, that the book of Judges is just a zoomed-in sort of microcosm of the way the whole of human history works, that it's cyclical, that there's nothing new under the sun, to quote Solomon, that there is this sense that we've seen this before and it's going to come back again, and we're not really making progress. The antidote to that theory of history, the sort of opposite of that, would be a really progressive sense of history, really optimistic. We're moving towards some great conclusion. Evolutionary theorists are the most optimistic of all. Things are getting better. We're improving. We've definitely left the dark ages behind. Humanity is moving towards some kind of climax. Although in their instance, I suppose the climax is quite an anti-climax, just a kind of heat death or whimper that the universe finishes with. But there's this sense of a direction of movement. The book of Ruth, alongside the book of Judges, shows us that God really agrees partly with both and disagrees partly with both. That it's dangerous for us to reject the cyclical view of history out of hand, to get all high and mighty and say our generation has moved places that no generation has gone before, that we're closer to enlightenment or civilization than we've ever been before, and that the old problems aren't ours again. You actually only need to think of the kind of rejection of authority, the big human rights movement, the rejection of the family values and sort of old school structures of conservative way of life that was happening around Woodstock in the 60s, and that our millennials are now diving into exactly in the same way. You know, yes, we believe in rights. No, we don't really believe in responsibilities. Yes, we believe in feelings. No, we don't really believe in authority. That stuff that's going on now has definitely happened before. And although back then the sort of silly reaction to all of that hippie Woodstock type of movement was this greedy capitalistic drive that the baby boomers engaged in, well, you can say we're probably going to do a similar thing again, that the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. And that's just a kind of anecdotal example out of recent Western history. But prophetic history shows us something similar. It's what makes it so difficult to nail down a date for the end times. It's what's so dangerous about trying to just interpret apocalyptic prophecies clearly, is that you can see before Jesus came, prophets had sort of expected that he was going to come, and he'd come in foreshadowings throughout the Easter series. We spoke about these types of Christ, that David was a bit of a type of Christ, that Noah has had some Christ experiences, as has Jonah, and there are all these amazing sort of allusions. It's as if God repeats himself throughout history to make his point, so that then when he really does it for real, it doesn't catch us totally by surprise. But you can see from the prophetic vantage point in the books of Daniel, for example, it's like, is Jesus coming? Has he already come? Is this Antichrist something out of Rome or something out of Persia or something that's still to come? Is Jesus' second coming immediately after the first coming, or is there a bit of a distance? And the second coming that we're anticipating, does that sort of come in cycles as well? Certainly if you look at Revelation, it feels as though things get worse and a bit better and worse and a bit better and worse and a bit better. And when things eventually come to their conclusion, it's almost like deja vu. So God seems to be okay with a cyclical view of history, that he will work in cyclical ways almost, to forewarn us for what he's ultimately going to do, to help us as we pendulum back and forth, as we react to our own fallenness. God then has to react to us, I suppose, in similar ways. So that purely optimistic, we're getting better and better, we're smarter than our previous generations, thing seems unhelpful, because it does seem like biblically some cycles take place. But then the book of Ruth lands slap bang in the middle of all these cycles of great judge, bad behavior, great judge, bad behavior. And the book of Ruth proves there is a point. History is moving somewhere, that it's not just cyclical with no kind of destination in mind. The book of Ruth arrives and we can see there's a lineage, there's this guy Obed, and then Jesse, and then the King David, who's going to end up being Jesus' ancestor, that we are moving towards the Messiah coming. He comes once and for all to save us, then he comes back again to take us home, that there is an ultimate story here. And so I love the idea that as you read the book of Judges, you get the sense of it's cyclical and we shouldn't take ourselves so seriously and think that we're immune to falling into the same cycles that humanity has fallen into before. We're not cleverer, we're not smarter, we're not more moral. We're doing the exact same things that have been done before, making the same mistakes and then reacting to those mistakes in the same overreaction that's happened before. And God is comfortable to work in those cycles. But ultimately there's a conclusion. There's a story, there's a thread that's moving to a glorious climax. And the book of Ruth shows us that. There's one final thing I want you to notice in the book of Judges, which you'll have read in those first few chapters, and that's this tribe of Judah versus this tribe of Benjamin. They seem to kind of be typical examples of the two wrong ways to behave. Judah, for all that they're not perfect, seem to grab hold of the promises of God and resemble really what the people of God are supposed to look like. The tribe of Benjamin seems to be quite slack and prepared to just take the easy route out and coexist with things. And if this story of Ruth teaches us anything, it's that coexistence is not an option. Tolerance is not an option for God. One of the fascinating things that happens if we flick back to the first chapter of Ruth is that you'll see that Elimelech and his family head off to Moab. Crazy. Moab shouldn't have even been there. They should have been eradicated, right? And they head out of the people of God and away from the purposes and processes of God in order to try and see some greener grass on the other side, and tragedy happens when they get there. But I want you to notice the names of his sons, Mahlon and Chilion. No Jewish lineage anywhere in the Old Testament has those names in it. Those aren't Hebrew names. Mahlon and Chilion are Canaanite names. Canaan is the name of the country that they had come to, that was promised to them, that the Israelites had come to claim. And so the fact that they've been given Canaanite names is a great example of how they're trying to just kind of sublimate into the wider Middle Eastern community, not be noticed so much. They just want to grab hold of some of what seems helpful in culture as opposed to being identifiably the people of God. And so Elimelech not only leaves the people and promises and purposes of God, but also creates a family that seems really tolerant and really kind of pro-coexistence. And that's the beginning of the end for them. Because as they end up in this foreign land, trying not to stand out too much, things go terribly wrong. And this is where we're going to finish this first look at the book of Ruth, this first week, is this amazing relationship that gets struck up between Naomi and Ruth. Naomi, the mother-in-law, Ruth, the daughter-in-law, she has another daughter-in-law, Orpah, who doesn't end up featuring in the story any longer. But there's this incredible friendship that seems to get struck up, where this Naomi, who's in a foreign land, married to a guy who's lost his faith to some extent, with sons who take Moabite wives, which they really shouldn't do, and she loses them all. In that day and age, your family structure was your economic hope. The person you'd married and the lineage that was behind them and the land that they had available to them was your economic security. So she loses all of this and has two foreigner daughter-in-laws who really, if they were to be wise, would stick in Moab where they've got some connections and got some chance possibly of getting married again. Maybe their folks still live there. There are some networks in the community. And it makes sense for Naomi to leave. She's a Hebrew. She shouldn't be in the middle of these Moabites. And now that her husband's gone, there's no real opportunity for her to earn any income. She's too old to get married again. It's a bleak situation. So Naomi, with not a lot of optimism, thinks, well, I better head back to the tribe of Judah, to my homeland in the area of Bethlehem, and hope for the best. Not that there's much hope, When she gets back there, she tells the ladies, call me Mara, call me bitter, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. So she doesn't come back full of hope, but she does come back with this daughter-in-law, this Moabitess, Ruth. What on earth would motivate her to come back? What on earth would cause Ruth to leave what's known, to go to what's foreign, to go to a place where she will be an outcast, where according to Deuteronomy 23, she's not even allowed to worship, she shouldn't be engaged with at all. She's going to get there and be at huge risk, xenophobic risk. And we can see that because when she starts to glean in Boaz's fields, Boaz immediately says, don't go gleaning on the edge because something terrible might happen. In fact, my men might even do something terrible to you. And if you read in chapter 2, Boaz has to say, come to the center where it's safer. So it's not safe for her there. There's no hope for her there. Ruth's got no chance of marrying some Israelites. Surely they wouldn't be interested in her. She's got no economic opportunities or connections there. So what was going on in this friendship that caused Ruth to want to stick with Naomi, stick so tight to her that she's prepared to say that amazing line where she refuses to let Naomi leave without her? It's in verse 16 of chapter 1, and it's just beautiful. I'm going to read it to you. Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. What an amazing thing. Most of us, I think, do friendship because it's likely to add some value to our lives. In fact, most of us even do faith because we think it's likely to add some value to our lives. Ruth is saying, I'm sticking with you, Naomi, even though I'm pretty sure that the little value that's left in my life is going to be taken because of this decision. That where I'm going to go, I'm likely to die. She's anticipating death. Where I go, I'm not going to be one of your people, but I'm going to somehow hope that they become my people. I'm going to chase down your God because I want him to be my God. And essentially what she's doing is in making that decision towards faith and towards friendship, she's giving up everything that seems green about the grass that she's currently standing on. All the stuff that Elimelech left to go and get, the opportunities of Moab, she's saying, I'm going to leave this supposedly green grass and go back there because I want to be part of the people of God. So what went on in that friendship? That in the midst of that situation, Naomi showed enough of the character of God that Ruth couldn't help but want to be her friend. And then she couldn't leave and didn't want to be got rid of, and eventually was able to redeem Naomi. That's the amazing end to the story, that Ruth did something wonderful. And essentially her choice was, I'm going to go where my faith might live, even though I might die, instead of staying here where I'll probably live, but my faith will certainly die. So that's no friendship of convenience. That's no faith of convenience. That's not a value add. And I'm fascinated by what must have been going on there. So that's some context. That's some gleaning, sorry to use the Boaz term, of what's going on in the background to that first chapter. The story of the judges and Benjamin and Judah, those two tribes, and how wonderfully this story is going to play out within that tribe of Judah. Okay, so now you have all that context. I want you to ask yourself a question about your friendships, your relationships. Because Ruth raises some troubling questions around the depth, the seriousness, the longevity of the friendships that we find ourselves in, doesn't it? I mean, Ruth is so radically loyal to Naomi. And this story seems to be juxtaposing that kind of loyalty against the frivolous up and down stuff that was going on in the book of Judges. Most of us kind of get the idea of being loyal to our spouse. I don't even know that we still feel loyal to our companies any longer. People used to feel, fired up to get the gold watch. Maybe some of you feel loyal to your church. I'm not sure. Maybe you feel loyal to your nation or potentially more to your city these days. But loyalty is kind of out, isn't it? And self-determination is in. And yet Ruth makes an amazing case for loyalty in friendships. And I mean, I'm just your friend. Does this mean that I'm not covenanted to you somehow? How much should you really expect from me? How much am I kind of committed to this community forever and ever? Maybe the people sitting around you in the room right now, you don't want to make eye contact with them because you're nervous. That signals some kind of permanent connection. But I want us to start asking questions about our friendships. Are they just value adds? Are they just friendships of convenience? Or is there something hidden in the gospel, the way God went after us and made us his friends, even though we were enemies before, that speaks to the way we should do friendship? What does real friendship and real relationship look like? And what could it look like in light of the way God has been a friend to us? That's the conversation I want you to have. And you can put it all on the table. Unrealistic expectations, codependence, selfishness, shallow society that Durban in some cases is. Or if we get too into this to become cliquey, put it all on the table and let's try and chart a way forward to do friendships that are really good, that can have great results like this one. Enjoy the conversation.